Now, Undertaker also appeared on the Broken Skull sessions with Steve Austin for one more round, which actually did turn out to be a totally brand new interview. This was not footage from the first time that wasn't used. It looks like they brought him on back for another taping, and they went another 2 hours. And this is what I've been waiting for all this month of Undertaker programming on the network. This is what I had been waiting the most to see. Austin is great on these shows. I don't think I've seen a bad Broken Skull sessions yet with Stone Cold. He's done them with Flair, Kurt Angle, Jerry Lawler. He did another one with Big Show, Kane, 2 now with The Undertaker. Bret, right? He had Bret Hart on. They've all been great. And Austin in this role, I think he's fantastic. He does a pretty good job asking the questions that I would have wanted to ask when it came to stories about, WrestleMania 14 behind the scenes. And then I also find myself screaming like, follow up on that, or ask him a question about this, and then he doesn't do it. But I think he did a tremendous job with it. What I just wanted to do here for a few minutes, I'm not going to go through everything they talked about, but people wanted me to kind of give my thoughts on this. I figured I'd pull just some of the key stories and the key points that they discussed to highlight here. They were talking about what makes a world champion. And Undertaker said that when you think of world champions, you think of guys like Ric Flair, right? You think of a guy like Flair comes to mind immediately, or Harley Race. And it depends on how old you are. If you're a younger person, you're not going to think of those two. You're going to think of Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. You're going to think of Stone Cold and The Rock. Or you're going to think of John Cena and Randy Orton and Edge and people like that, depending on how young or new of a fan that you are. But Austin asked him, how important was the title to you? How important was the title to the Undertaker character? Because he didn't really need the title, right? He didn't really need the belt. And Undertaker agreed and said that, it was a situation where he was a great guy to put in there who always came close but got screwed. And that's what I remember, right? When I'm growing up an Undertaker fan, there were multiple times where he came close and then he got screwed out of the championship. Royal Rumble 94. Every heel on the roster comes out and screws him out of winning the casket match with Yokozuna. And you could find other examples of that too. The time he almost beat Bret at the Royal Rumble, but Diesel came out and screwed him over. He was that guy who could come close, so he would still come off as unbeatable. Oh, he had the match won, he hit the tombstone, but then somebody would come out and fuck him over. And so he talked about that. And he said it was hard too, because even though he was the champion a few times, he was always the big babyface monster. And when you're the babyface monster champion, it makes more sense to chase than it does to just hold on to the title. Now, if you're a heel monster champion, that makes more sense. That was basically the role that Brock Lesnar was in for years. And he mowed down everybody on the roster. He probably mowed down way too many people, to the point where it was not believable that anybody existed on that roster that could beat this guy. But it does generally work better if you have a heel monster champion in that role. A Brock Lesnar, a big Van Vader, somebody like that, as opposed to Undertaker, who never really held the belt for a long period of time. He had it for a few months here, a few months there. I mean, I'm guessing the longest world title run that he probably had was probably the second one, right? When he beat Sid for it at WrestleMania 13, he had that belt until SummerSlam. That might have been the longest run he ever had as the champion. And that's all it really had to be. Didn't need to be any longer than that. And that's another match where he got screwed over. WrestleMania 18. He talked about Vince McMahon pulling him into his office and saying, look, I got to apologize. I feel ashamed. Mark, I don't have anything for you. You kind of fell through and imagine that, The Undertaker falls through the cracks, and Vince McMahon realizes, oh shit, we don't have any plans for him, and WrestleMania is coming up very soon. He says, look, I got 2 guys. There's 2 guys I could offer you as an opponent. He goes, you could do a match with Rob Van Dam, or I could give you Ric Flair. And Undertaker says, before the words even left his lips, as soon as Vince said Flair, he goes, Flair. And he says Vince was shocked. He thought for sure he was going to pick RVD. RVD was the younger guy, right? The young new guy. Vince says, really? He goes, are you sure? Undertaker's like, absolutely. And he said, it wasn't that he had anything against RVD. He goes, I got time to work with Rob, but I want to work with Rick. They worked together. I know they worked together at least once because I remember seeing photos of it. They never had any one-on-one matches on TV during Flair's first run of the company in 91, 92. But they had, I think, a few house show matches. And, from Undertaker's point of view, at that point, Ric Flair was whatever he was, 50-something years old. He didn't know how many more matches at WrestleMania Flair had left in him. And he respected Flair and grew up a big fan of Flair. And obviously, he's like, yeah, of course I want to work with Ric Flair. Are you kidding me? I could work with RVD anytime. And they did. They worked together for the hardcore title and stuff later on. But he said Vince was shocked. He really thought that he would pick RVD. He couldn't understand it. Because you want to work with him? Undertaker said absolutely. Austin talked about the WrestleMania records for some other big names in the company. Triple H has a WrestleMania record of 10-13. So for all the talk about Triple H holding guys down and burying them, and believe me, there was a period where that did happen. When you look at his WrestleMania record, it's not as great as some people might think. Shawn Michaels, Mr. WrestleMania. His WrestleMania record is even less impressive, I think. 6-11. John Cena, 10-5. Hulk Hogan, 8-3-1 from that one draw in the WrestleMania 4 tournament that he had with Andre. Stone Cold, 5-2. That is a shockingly low number of WrestleMania matches for one of the biggest names of all time. And Austin was asking Undertaker, what was going through your head when Vince McMahon made that call that Brock's going to be the one to break the streak? And he goes, when I got to the building that day, I was going over. And it wasn't until a few hours before the match, he's in his locker room and in walks Vince, and he knew right away because Vince didn't come to you. If Vince wanted to talk to you, he would send one of his minions to come get you and bring you to his office. So he knew right away. Oh shit. The finish is changing. And Vince explained himself and said, look, he goes, we're going to have Brock beat you. And Undertaker was like, well, he goes, are you sure? And he goes, Vince McMahon's argument was very simple. He says, if not Brock, then who? Who is believable enough to be the one to break the streak? If not Brock Lesnar, then who? And Undertaker said, well, all right, if that's how you feel, then that's what we'll do. He said, could I have fought it? He goes, probably, but he didn't put up a fight. He definitely did not agree with the decision. That much is clear. Undertaker makes it very clear. He did not think that Brock Lesnar needed it. He did not think that Brock Lesnar was the right person to break the streak. And WWE, to their credit, they followed through hard. They kept Brock strong. But still, was Brock the right person? Did he need that win in order to push him as hard as they eventually pushed him? No. Not really. They could have pushed him hard anyway. In fact, he could have come out of that WrestleMania loss even angrier over losing and gone on just a monster tear. Undertaker now, with the benefit of hindsight and everything, he says he would have much rather have saved it for a guy like Roman. So he would have preferred that if it was going to end, it be somebody like Roman Reigns ending it. But you listen to him speak, I think he would have been fine with not ending it. All this talk about Undertaker's old school, and of course he was going to do the honors for somebody. At some point during this interview, he basically said he kind of figured that he would just kind of retire undefeated and go into the Hall of Fame that way. That's the way it should have been done. So to answer Vince McMahon's question, if not Brock, then who? How about nobody? How about that? You've got this special thing, you can tease it every year, but how about when Undertaker gets to a nice round number, you just quit while you're ahead and let the guy go off into the sunset forever undefeated at WrestleMania. He didn't have to lose to anybody. The streak never should have been broken in the first place. And if you were going to break it, then Undertaker is right. There were better ways to go about doing it. But think about that. One of the most famous matches in company history for who won and who lost. And it was only a few hours before the show that it was even decided upon. It wasn't like they had this set in stone for weeks in advance. Almost on a whim. on the whims of one person, we're going to go in a different direction. They walked through highlights of the first Hell in a Cell match with Undertaker and Shawn Michaels back in '97. Still the best Hell in a Cell match of all time. Austin said as much in this interview. He's 100% correct about that. Talked about Kane's debut. Talked about WrestleMania 14. This is one of the things that I would have asked Undertaker about if I were interviewing him, because this has long been a story, or some might say an urban legend. Is it true? Is it not true? Undertaker's already talked about this. So this really wasn't a shock. I would have wanted to ask him anyway just so he can expand on it. But when he did an out-of-character interview before WrestleMania 18 with Michael Landsberg on his off-the-record show, he talked about this. And he talked about being in the back at WrestleMania. I think he mentioned taping up the fist. And he said it was going to be a long night for Shawn Michaels if he didn't do the right thing. So this is not the first time Undertaker has commented about this. But he talked about he worked with Kane and had what he thought was a pretty good match. But the entire time, his mind was on the main event. There were stories in the locker room. Is Shawn going to do the right thing? Is he going to do business? Is he going to lose and drop the title to Stone Cold? Or is he going to, pitch a fit? Is he going to walk out? Are there going to be problems? Because they all knew Austin was the future. Undertaker said, for business, we had to get the belt on you, Steve. You were the guy. Everything was being banked on you. We had to get the title on you. And he said that he basically was kind of like the insurance policy in the back. So he had his match with Kane, but now he is laser focused on this main event. And he's in the back and he's sitting by the gorilla position. He never had a conversation with Vince McMahon about anything. It was just, they had to know. If they saw Undertaker, they saw him sitting there, they had to know what was going on. But he says he never talked to anybody, never talked to Vince about it. Vince didn't tell him, hey, I need you for just in case or anything like that. He took it upon himself. And he said, if Shawn was going to walk out, I was going to walk out there and make sure he got his ass back in that ring. And it would have made sense, too, because Undertaker had feuded with Shawn on TV just prior to this. So if, let's say, the heel tries to bail in the middle of the match, well, here comes the Undertaker, right, to make sure that he can't leave and he goes back into the ring. They could have played it off like in a kayfabe way where I think people wouldn't have known kind of what was going on here. But yeah, he was ready to do whatever needed to be done. He was taping up his fists and he was watching very intently in the back, right there in the gorilla position. He was watching what was going on. And Austin, he asked the question because he wanted an answer. And when Undertaker told the story, Austin said, wow, man, he goes, that's really cool. I like that you had my back like that. I didn't know that until now, but that's cool to hear. And Undertaker said, look, dude, we could not have him leave as the champion that night. You were the guy. You were the guy that was chosen to lead the company. It had to go to you that night. Yeah, Tyson was there. All eyes were on this match. It had to go to you. Austin brought up the Montreal Screwjob. Again, I feel like every time I tell you guys, this is the last time I'm going to talk about the Montreal Screwjob. We just had the anniversary, right? I just talked about it a couple of weeks ago. Here it is again. Austin brings up the Montreal Screwjob. There's our annual mention of it. And talks about the story of Undertaker going to Vince McMahon after the Screwjob happened. Undertaker being very upset and going to Vince. What happened? What really happened that night? And he said his view is there just had to be a better way to go about handling it. So he's in the back. He immediately goes to find Vince. And he didn't know that Vince was already on his way to go see Brett. So he encountered Vince in the hallway. And he makes it very clear to him, this is bullshit. You've got to go talk to him and apologize to him. And he says, I'm actually on my way there right now. Because here's the thing about this, and he did not talk about this, but when Undertaker has given interviews recently and talked about the Montreal stuff, yeah, he says that there's two perspectives on it. My perspective was my friend had gotten screwed. I'm one of the boys. And then you hear Vince's perspective and he was just protecting his company and blah, blah, blah. But Undertaker has been convinced that had Vince McMahon come to him, or somebody in the company came to him before any of this happened, and just asked for his help, because he had a rapport with both guys. Even if he didn't really like Shawn, he wasn't as friendly with Shawn as he was with Bret. You know, they were still colleagues, they were still friendly with each other, they worked together. He had a relationship with both guys. He could have talked to one of them or talked to both of them and gotten it worked out ahead of time. And here's the thing that kills me about it. He had no match on the show that night. Kane was wrestling his first singles match on pay-per-view that night. Undertaker was there, clearly. He was in Montreal in the back. He didn't have a match. He had no role on that show, but he was there. So you and I talked about my triple threat idea, that if you had to come to some kind of resolution here, I know the match was Bret versus Shawn, but Undertaker was right in the thick of it. He had just come off 2 pay-per-view matches with Shawn Michaels, and he had other matches, right, with Bret Hart. He was as much a part of that feud as anybody. They didn't do triple threat matches back then in WWE, but you could have promoted it as the first ever on pay-per-view. Triple threat match. The main event of Survivor Series, Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart, and The Undertaker for the WWF Championship. And Undertaker would have been in there either to take the losing fall, let Shawn pin him so Bret doesn't have to get pinned, or Undertaker can just win. So Shawn doesn't have to win in Montreal. Undertaker wins. I'm sure Bret would have been okay with that, and then Undertaker could then go on to wrestle Shawn one more time, and he can drop the belt to Shawn. He ended up losing to Shawn 3 times anyway. He lost to him in the casket match of the Royal Rumble. So in this case, he would have just dropped the championship to him. And perhaps all of this could have been avoided. He believes that. And he said Vince didn't have to come to me, but he was considered this locker room leader who knew both guys and worked with them. And why didn't you just come to me? I could have tried to work it out. I could have talked to Brad, or I could have talked to Shawn. We could have worked something out. You know what? I think they probably could have. And it would have made total sense. Didn't even have a match that night. Talked about Wrestler's Court. Undertaker was usually the judge. Austin brings up a story about Teddy Long that I think he said Teddy Long gave him permission to tell. Story about Teddy Long and Wrestler's Court that also involved Mae Young, and apparently Teddy came into possession of some little blue diamond-shaped pills, and he had more of them that he could use. He got them from someone free of charge, and what he decided to do was, the great humanitarian that he is, well, he's the great capitalist that he is, right? We do live in a capitalist society here. He decided to sell the pills to some of the boys on the roster. Even though he got them for free, he was going to sell them to some of the wrestlers. And JBL got wind of this, and Teddy was brought up on charges of selling Viagra to the boys. Mae Young was a witness, and Undertaker is just laughing his ass off as he tells this story. He says Mae Young was a witness, and Mae was more upset that all of these young guys, all you guys, you're so young and healthy, and all you guys need all of this Niagara. That's what she called it. She didn't call it Viagra, she called it Niagara. Teddy was found guilty. Undertaker says, look, it was more entertainment than anything serious. It was our way of trying to handle things internally before it spiraled out of control. And it was our way of letting guys know, look, you're screwing up here. Shape up. He said it was a way to make light of things while also getting a point across. Now that's his version of the story. I've heard other things about this Wrestler's Court shit that isn't so rosy. And some people, and stories about Howard Finkel and how horrible stuff that just comes off as really dumb and immature. I mean, the idea of it, I get what he's saying. It's just a kind of a fun way to handle things internally. Like if you lose, your punishment, I think, usually was that you had to buy alcohol for the judge, or buy alcohol for all the guys and stuff. I get that, but there's some stories out there that are anything but fun. Hell in a Cell, 1998. They talked about what is probably, I think it's safe to say that this is probably the most famous match Undertaker has ever been involved in. There's never been a match more famous or infamous than the Hell in a Cell match in 98 that Undertaker has been a part of. There have been better matches. You know, and even the match with Brock at WrestleMania 30, I mean, that was a shocking finish. But it is definitely not ranked higher on the famous match list for The Undertaker than the second Hell in a Cell with Mankind. He talked about the Mankind bump off the top of the cell, the first one, and how he didn't want to do it. Mick told him what he wanted to do. He's like, I'm not doing that. It's too dangerous. It's not needed. And Mick went around his back. He went to Vince and pitched it to Vince and said, I could do it. I could do it safely. And so they ended up doing it. But he said, I didn't want to do it. That was all Mick. Then he talked about the second bump. That was the chokeslam spot through the cage. And even the first bump, let alone the second one, his only concern was, please move. He wanted, when he saw Mick land, he wanted him to just move a limb. He just wanted to know he was alive and that he wasn't paralyzed. Same thing on the second bump, which was even scarier. Said the second bump didn't quite go the way it was supposed to go. The cage was supposed to give way, he claims, but only a little bit. And basically, the both of them, I don't know how this would have worked. I mean, they were up there pretty high. But I guess the cage would kind of give way, and as they put more weight on it, it would give way more and more, and they would almost, like, slowly, both of them would kind of fall into the ring. Maybe they would dangle or so. I don't know. But he claims that was the idea. But he noticed, right before he chokeslammed him, he could tell that the cage was kind of giving way. And he said that he made a conscious decision to step onto one of the beams. So Undertaker was not standing on like the mesh portion. Had he not done that, had he not stepped onto like one of the steel beams, he would have fallen through with Mick. And he says it would have been a catastrophic situation. It just would have been so much worse. As bad as it would have been so much worse. He says his concern was, again, Mick, just move. He thought he was dead. He just wanted to make sure he was alive and not paralyzed. And those rings back then were like concrete. I don't know why it took until 98, 99, I think it was, finally, for Vince McMahon to change the freaking rings. You go back and you watch those in the 80s shows and the 90s shows, they had no give. No wonder these guys, half of them were walking around crippled up. You would be too if you had to work on rings like that. I think actually, as the story goes, when Vince McMahon started to wrestle a little bit with the feud with Austin, and he was taking bumps, that's when the rings changed. I think that's when the rings changed. When he realized, oh shit, this hurts. This ring doesn't have any give to it. We should change them and make them a little bit softer. Then the rings got changed. Fuck all the guys that came before that. I find it hard to believe that in those 10 or 15 years, nobody said a word about the rings. I mean, if everybody kept their mouth shut, then how would he know? But I do find that funny. I think that's the story, that it was around the time Vince started to take bumps that he realized we should probably change the rings. He talked about the Elimination Chamber story when he got burned by the pyro. His skin was bubbling. They had people feeding him bottles of water from underneath the pod because he was going to be in the pod for 20 minutes, then enter the match and wrestle for 20 minutes. So imagine you're burned by pyro. Your skin is just bubbling up. And you've got to stay in this pod, this enclosed pod, for 20 minutes. And not sell it, too. You don't want to sell the fact that you're just in writhing pain. So he was not very happy about what happened. And really what made him angry is the fact that he approached the pyro guy a couple of weeks before the pay-per-view. I think this was the Elimination Chamber. I think it was the Chamber in 2010. But he approached the guy 2 weeks before and said, look, these explosions and these flames are getting too close. We've got to do something about it. And he said the pyro guy was like, no, it's just, it was just the drafts. It's going to be fine. Don't worry about it. So he told the guy. And it was almost as if the pyro guy just blew him off. And then he almost died because of the pyro guy. Says, had he not doused himself with water, he just happened to pour a bottle of water. He was wearing a different kind of jacket. He was wearing the championship. He wanted to show the belt off, so he picked a duster jacket to wear instead of his usual jacket. That, coupled with pouring the bottle of water on his head, is what saved him from being even, burned worse than he was. They showed a picture of the jacket, all burned up. One sleeve was shorter than the other. Hey, that's scary stuff. I believe he didn't mention this, but I'm pretty sure the pyro guy was fired after the match. They probably saved his life, because if he was still in the back when the Undertaker got back there, as angry as he was, that pyro guy, that would have been the end of him anyway. So it was good for him that he got fired. Austin brought up the Undertaker's brother passing away the day before the Boneyard match was filmed this year for WrestleMania. This was also talked about in the Last Ride documentary. But he talked about how tough it was because the match had to be filmed. You have COVID going on, so travel is not exactly the easiest thing. There was nothing at that point that he could do, so he didn't rush back home or anything, but he was the one. He's got a lot of siblings, but I guess he was the one that had to call his mother and tell her that, her son had passed away. And this all happened the day before they filmed the match with him and AJ at WrestleMania, which was the best WrestleMania match that Undertaker has had in years. Now, it wasn't a match in the traditional sense. It was more of a fight scene, but it was the best thing Undertaker had done at WrestleMania since, honestly, if you're asking my personal opinion, that was the best thing Undertaker did at WrestleMania since the match with Punk at WrestleMania 29. I know the match with Bray Wyatt at 31 was a nice comeback for him, coming off that horrible match at 30, but I think the match with Wyatt, it wasn't a great match. The match with Shane, it was what it was. I don't look back on that as being some kind of great match. The match with Roman was horrible. The match with Cena was, 2 minutes long. 35, he wasn't even on the card. The last great thing that he did at WrestleMania before the Boneyard was the match with CM Punk at WrestleMania 29. But he had all of this on his mind and all of this going on, but he stuck it out and filmed the match, and it was about 7 or 8 hours of filming in the outdoors, and he got it done. And you know what? Looking back, if that is it for him at Mania, if he never has another Mania match again, you're not going to be able to go out on a higher quality note, I don't think, than that match. Undertaker asked him, Austin asked him, he goes, look, are you good? Are you good with how things are right now? And he says, I've come to peace with the fact that physically I can't do the things that I want to do. I can't do the things that I used to do. I can't be the Undertaker that I want to be. He goes, it doesn't mean I don't want to do it. If I could do it for the rest of my life until the day I die, he goes, I would do it. Because it's in my blood and I love it and I don't want to give it up. He goes, I know I can go another 2 or 3 years. People say to him, why don't you just make an entrance and come out and chokeslam somebody or give somebody a tombstone? He goes, I could do that. But it would be disrespecting the other talent, and it would be disrespecting the Undertaker, persona to just come out and do that. So it's not something that he wants to do. He says he is at peace with it, but if Vince McMahon ever needed him and came calling, well, that's a whole other story. And that's kind of where things are right now, right? He in his mind believes that he's done, but if Vince McMahon picks up the phone and he picks it up and sees area code 203, he sees that Stamford area code, then we may very well see more of The Undertaker at some point down the road. It's a shame there were no fans in the crowd for Survivor Series, but he's going to be inducted into the Hall of Fame in the next few years, and he'll get that reaction. He'll get the reaction from actual people that he did not get last Sunday. And when he goes into the Hall of Fame, he can get All Elite Scooby-Doo to induct him. Undertaker on Cameo is the thing I didn't know I needed, but I'm glad that we got it.